The morning I turned 71, I made myself a cup of coffee, walked out to the back deck, and watched the street Lawrence move the way it always does in October, slow and gray and indifferent to everything happening on the shore. My neighbor Gerald called over the fence to wish me happy birthday. I waved. A Canada goose landed on the water and then lifted off again almost immediately, as if it had changed its mind. I understood that feeling. I had been a civil engineer for 34 years. I worked for the city of Kingston, Ontario, and I spent the better part of 3 decades calculating load tolerances, reviewing drainage systems, and making sure that the bridges people drove over every day would hold. Nobody ever thanked you for that work. The bridge stood. People crossed it. That was the whole point. I retired at 66 with a modest pension, a firm handshake from my department head, and a card signed by 42 colleagues. My wife Patricia had passed 4 years before that, from a stroke that took her quickly, mercifully, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, while she was planting the first tulip bulbs of the season. She never saw them bloom. After she was gone, I learned how to make her lentil soup. I painted the guest room a color she had always wanted, a soft sage green, and I never told anyone why. I kept her reading glasses on the table beside the couch because moving them felt like losing something I wasn't ready to lose. The house was a 4-bedroom in the Williamsville area, paid off 12 years before I retired, and it sat on a corner lot with a maple tree in the front yard that turned the most unreasonable shade of red every autumn. Patricia had loved that tree more than she loved most people. My son Callum was 38 when this story begins. He worked in commercial real estate in Toronto, which is about 270 kilometers from Kingston, which is about 270 kilometers further than I sometimes wished. He had his mother's eyes in my stubbornness, and when he was 26 he called me from a restaurant patio to tell me he had met someone extraordinary. Her name was Deanna. She was a marketing consultant, originally from Calgary, with a sharp laugh and sharper opinions and the kind of confidence that fills a room before she even speaks. I liked her well enough at first. She was interesting. She asked good questions at the dinner table. She looked at Callum the way you hope someone will look at your child. They married when Callum was 31 and Deanna was 29. The wedding was in Niagara-on-the-Lake at a vineyard on a Saturday in June that was so beautiful it almost hurt to look at. I gave a speech. I talked about Patricia, about what she would have said, about the way she used to tell Callum that the right person would make him more himself, not less. There were people crying. I was one of them. Deanna hugged me afterward and said I was wonderful. I believed her. Things change slowly enough that you almost don't notice. That's the cruelest part. It isn't a single moment that shifts everything. It's a Tuesday when Callum doesn't call back. It's Christmas when they have plans with Deanna's family in Calgary and next year. Dad, I promise. It's the way his voice changes slightly on the phone when she's in the room, not in the content of what he says, but in the texture of it. The way a door sounds different when someone is standing on the other side. By the time Callum was 35, I was seeing him perhaps 3 times a year. Deanna was pleasant when I visited, but there was a quality to her pleasantness that reminded me of a building that looks structurally fine until you check the foundation. She had opinions about the house. Not stated outright, but present the way she would glance at Patricia's reading glasses and then glance away, the way she once described the sage green guest room as very retro. When I showed Callum the tulip beds I had kept going since his mother died, he nodded in the way people nod when they are somewhere else in their mind entirely. I told myself it was normal. I told myself this was how marriages worked, that sons moved toward their own lives and that was right and good and what Patricia would have wanted. I told myself a lot of things standing at the kitchen sink, watching the maple tree in the front yard, making lentil soup for one. In the spring of what I am now calling the difficult year, Callum called me on a Wednesday evening and told me he and Deanna were coming to Kingston for the long weekend. He said it casually, the way you say things when they are simple. I drove to the market on Thursday morning and bought pickerel and new potatoes and a lemon tart from the bakery that Callum had loved since he was 12. I put fresh towels in the sage green room. I cut the first peonies from the garden, Patricia's favorite, and put them in a glass jar on the kitchen table. They arrived Friday evening. Deanna was on her phone in the car before they pulled into the driveway and still on it when she came through the door. She said hi. Gorgeous house as always in the tone of someone completing a required task, and then went upstairs to finish her call. Callum hugged me and said she had a difficult client situation. I said of course. We stood in the kitchen, and I made tea, and we talked about his work and about a property development in Etobicoke that was giving him trouble, and it was fine. It was all fine. It was the particular kind of fine that is its own form of ache. Dinner was quiet. Diana ate carefully, the way people eat when they are calculating something. She asked about the neighborhood property values, about whether I'd had the house assessed recently, about what I thought the market looked like for a corner lot in Williamsville. I answered honestly. I had, in fact, had it assessed the previous fall for estate planning purposes. She nodded at that, slowly, the way people nod when they receive information they find useful. After dinner, Callum went to get more firewood from the garage. I was washing up at the sink. Deanna had her phone out again, and she didn't know, or perhaps didn't care, that the window above the sink faces the back deck, and that sound carries strangely in a house this old, when the windows are open and the evening is still. She was talking to someone, a friend I assumed, and her voice had the ease of a private conversation, unheld. She said something about the timing being good. She said something about how it made more sense to think about these things before things got complicated with the estate. She said that Callum was going to have to be realistic. I stood at the sink for a long time after she went back inside. I didn't say anything that weekend. I finished washing the dishes. I served the lemon tart. I sat by the fire and listened to Callum talk about a hockey game. When they left Sunday afternoon, Deanna said the peonies were beautiful and I should look into a floral subscription service. I stood in the driveway and waved until the car turned the corner. Then I went inside and called my lawyer. Her name was Renata, and I had been her client for 11 years. She was methodical and unhurried, and she had a quality I respected above almost everything else. She never told you what you wanted to hear. She told you what was true. I had met with her twice already in the past year to update my will and review the property arrangements. The third meeting, the one I made the Monday after that long weekend, was different. I told her what I had heard. I told her what I had been noticing for 3 years. I told her about the assessment and about Deanna's questions at dinner. Renata listened without interrupting, which she was very good at. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me for a moment. Then she opened her notebook, and we got to work. Over the following months, I made a series of decisions that I told no one about. The house was transferred into a trust, structured properly, with conditions I had thought about carefully. The conditions were not punitive. They were not designed out of anger. I want to be clear about that. I was not a man who operated from anger. Patricia had always said I process things like a drainage system, slowly and thoroughly, with nowhere for the pressure to build. I made the decisions from a place of clarity, the same clarity I had used for 34 years when calculating what a structure needed to hold and what it didn't. The trust ensured that the property would pass, on my death, to Callum in a life estate only. He could live in it, rent it, benefit from it, but it could not be sold without condition, could not be transferred to a spouse, and would pass at his death or in the event of a change in residency to a conservation land trust I had researched and respected, one that worked in partnership with a local indigenous land stewardship program in the Frontenac region. I had also, some months prior, quietly set aside a portion of my savings in a separate designated account for my granddaughter Nora Callum's daughter, from a brief relationship in his late 20s, who was 11 and lived in Kingston with her mother. Nora came to my house every second Saturday, and we made soup and watched nature documentaries, and she was, without question, the best person I knew. I did not tell Callum any of this. I did not tell Deanna. I continued to answer the phone when he called. I continued to send birthday cards and Christmas checks and attend the 1 or 2 visits a year that remained on the calendar. I watched. I waited. Not with bitterness. And I want you to understand that distinction, because it matters. There is a difference between waiting for justice and waiting for truth to make itself known. I was doing the second one. The restaurant was Deanna's idea. They were in Kingston in November, ostensibly to see Nora in a school concert, and Deanna suggested the 4 of us, meaning herself and Callum and Nora and I, go for dinner afterward, at a new place on Princess Street she had seen reviewed online. It was the kind of restaurant that has small plates and large prices, and a sommelier who explains the wine in more words than necessary. Nora wore a dress with small embroidered daisies, and she had a piece of her program tucked carefully into her bag. She had played the recorder in the concert, and she had been, objectively, excellent. We were seated, and menus were brought, and there was the usual movement of a table settling in. Nora sat beside me, and she told me in a low, serious voice that the piece they had performed was called Ode to the River, and that she had practiced it 40 times. I told her that was exactly the right number of times. She seemed satisfied with that. The waiter came to take our orders. He was young, patient, the kind of server who listens with his whole body. He went around the table. When he reached me, I ordered the pickerel and a glass of the Bachelder Pinot Noir from the Niagara region, which I had been wanting to try. He wrote it down and nodded, and then looked back to the table to confirm the order, the way good servers do. Deanna looked up from her menu. She looked at the waiter, and then she looked at Callum, and she said it in a light voice, the voice of someone stating something reasonable, the voice of someone who has said this kind of thing before. We'll just be doing separate bills. She gestured toward me in a way that was not unkind but was entirely clear. Dad can sort his own, she said. Callum said nothing. He looked at his menu. Nora looked at me. I looked at the waiter. The waiter, to his enormous credit, simply nodded and said, of course, no problem at all, and moved on. I folded my hands in my lap. I looked at the candle on the table. I thought about load tolerances. I thought about what a structure needs to hold. I thought about Nora's 40 practice sessions and Patricia's tulip bulbs and the sound of the street. Lawrence in October. I said nothing. Over the course of that dinner, I watched my son eat duck confit without meeting my eyes. I watched Deanna consult her phone twice and speak enthusiastically about a renovation they were planning in their Leslieville condo. I watched Nora eat her pasta with the focused pleasure of a child who has decided the adults around her are temporary weather, to be waited out. At the end of the meal, the waiter brought 2 bills as requested. I paid mine, which included Nora's pasta, without comment. I left a 22% tip. I helped Nora back into her coat, and I told her she had been remarkable in the concert. On the drive home, I dropped Nora at her mother's house first. She hugged me in the car, and I held on for a moment longer than usual. She didn't ask why. She was 11 and perceptive in the way some children are, the way that comes from watching the adults around them carefully and filing things away. I drove home along the waterfront. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a while with the engine off, looking at the maple tree, which had lost most of its leaves by then, the branches bare and exact against the November sky. The house was dark. I thought about going inside, and I thought about Deanna's voice on the deck in the spring, and I thought about the word realistic, and I thought about the fact that Callum had not looked at me once for the duration of that dinner. Then I went inside and made tea. 3 months later, Callum called me on a Tuesday evening, and his voice was different. Not the phone voice. Something else. He said he needed to talk. I said, all right. He said things had been difficult with Deanna for a while. He said he hadn't known how to say it. He said she had moved out in January, and that they were separating, and that he was sorry he hadn't called sooner. He didn't know what he had been afraid of exactly. Maybe he was afraid I wouldn't be surprised, which turned out to be its own kind of answer. I listened. I let him talk for a long time. He talked about the past several years, in the way people talk about a stretch of road they drove in bad visibility, not quite sure how they got through it. Relieved to be out of it, still slightly disoriented from the experience. He said that toward the end he had started noticing things, the way she talked about the house, the way she had started asking him questions about estate documents, about whether I had a will, about what the property was worth. He said it made him feel sick when he thought about it. He said he had excused things he shouldn't have excused. He said the restaurant had been one of them, that it had been wrong, that he had known it was wrong the second she said it, and he had said nothing, and he was sorry. I didn't tell him it was all right. I think that was important. I said I knew he meant the apology. I said I had been sad about some of it. I said I thought he was a good person who had been in a situation that made goodness difficult, and that I had not stopped believing that, even when it was hard to see. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then I told him I had some things to explain to him. About the trust, about the structure, about the decisions I had made over the past year and a half. I told him not because I needed him to thank me, and I told him that specifically, but because he was my son and Darty deserved to understand what I had built and why. He asked why I hadn't told him. I said because the architecture of a thing has to be finished before you explain it. It doesn't help anyone to describe the bridge while it's still being built. He laughed a little at that, in the way that sounds like relief. Nora turned 12 in April. I brought her to the conservation land in the Frontenac Arch, one of the most biologically significant corridors in eastern Ontario, where the Canadian Shield meets the Great Lakes lowlands, a place where birds stop on their migrations, and where the same ridge systems that run under the city streets run out into forest and exposed rock and the particular silence of places that have been themselves for a very long time. We walked for 3 hours. She found a piece of granite with a vein of quartz through it that she carried the rest of the way. She asked me why I had given money to the people who took care of this land. I told her that some things need to outlast us, and that was the best reason I knew for doing anything. She thought about that for a while. Then she said she was going to put the rock on her desk at school. That seemed right to me. Callum drove down from Toronto on the last weekend of May. We planted tomatoes in the back garden, the same way I had every spring for 20 years. He asked about Patricia's lentil soup recipe, and I said I would write it out for him. We didn't talk much about Deanna, and when we did, it was not with bitterness, which I want you to understand was a choice, made daily, the way most important choices are. He stayed until Sunday afternoon. Before he left, he stood in the front yard for a moment and looked at the maple tree, bare at the top still from a hard winter, and he said it was a good tree. I said it had always been. There are people reading this who will want to know about numbers, about what the house is worth, about the account, about who gets what and when. I understand that impulse. But I have spent a career working with numbers, and I can tell you that they are descriptions of value, not value itself. The trust exists. The account exists. The land exists. More important than any of them is what they are for, and what they are for is simple. They are for people who deserve to be cared for, whether or not they ever know the source of that care. That is the engineering principle underneath everything. You design for the load. You account for conditions you cannot predict. You build to hold. If there is something I could say to other parents who are watching from a distance, who are folding their hands in their laps and saying nothing, while something passes over the table that should not have passed, I would say this: silence is not the same as acceptance. Patience is not the same as passivity. There is a version of love that announces itself constantly and requires constant acknowledgement, and there is another version that simply does its work, adds its timber, checks its tolerances, and is still standing long after the noise has settled. The bridges I built are still there. People cross them every day. They don't know my name. That is exactly how it should be. And to the son who came back not perfectly, not immediately, but genuinely and with his own eyes open, I want to say, that is the thing I was most hoping to build. Not the trust, not the account, not even the conservation land, though I believe in it. The thing I was most hoping to build was the version of you that could find your way back to yourself. Your mother would have loved this garden in May. She would have said exactly what I'm saying now. Grow things that outlast you. Protect what cannot protect itself. And when you are not sure what the right thing is, be quiet and patient and wait, because integrity is not loud. It is structural. It is the thing that holds when everything else is under pressure, and it is the only inheritance worth leaving.